Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just broke down the winners and the losers from fall camp. Obviously, there were some teams that took some pretty bad injuries, definitely found themselves on the loser side of things, but for the most part, fall camp is a kind of a hard thing to judge. So, winners and losers is a little bit in between for the most part. But let's get into the new details around Nick Saban and Lane Kiffin, because there was a very, very interesting excerpt that was taken out of a book that is coming up that I'm definitely going to read from John Talty and Armin Kittian, and it's called The Price: What It Takes to Win in College Football's Era of Chaos. So essentially just breaking down how crazy the sport is right now and breaking down all of the behind the scenes stuff that these coaches have to deal with. And the newest excerpt that came out of this was around Nick Saban and Lane Kiffin. And it was about how Nick Saban and Lane Kiffin famously did not get along very well when they were at Alabama together. And there were some details that came out from this that were very, very interesting. And one of the biggest ones, obviously, was just the details around their relationship were not great, plain and simple. There were a lot of testy moments. There were a lot of different things that kind of got in their way when it came down to them really working together the way they wanted to. But at the end of the day, when it came down to it, this was a hire that Nick Saban needed to make, and it's something that I'll talk about here in a second. But the main crux of this story, the quote that everyone's running with, the quote that everyone's looking at, is rather expletive, so I will not necessarily say it on the show, but let's just say Nick Saban had called Jimmy Sexton late on in the process after Lane Kiffin had left the program and yelled at him, essentially, and yelled at him because he was mad that Jimmy Sexton had talked him into hiring Lane Kiffin to be his offensive coordinator after all the stuff at USC, after everything went down, and Nick Saban was none too happy about it after everything went down at the end of it, because Lane Kiffin, as we all know, or maybe you don't know, but he was fired before the national title in 2017. That never happens. And it happened because of a very, very interesting kind of story that was actually told on Josh Pate's show last night when he was talking about after the SEC title game. That was kind of the moniker of when Lane Kiffin was allowed to go out and seek other jobs, because he was a really good offensive coordinator. There were a number of teams trying to get him to be their head coach. Not necessarily crazy business, very much standard operating procedure there. But Nick Saban said, as long as it's after the SEC title, you're more than fine. Sounds like it was right after the SEC title. It sounds like Jimmy Sexton was waiting for Lane Kiffin with a phone, and he was on the phone with, presumably, the FAU AD and getting a job offer. So definitely a very, very interesting situation right after they won an SEC title and were heading to another national title for all of that to be going down. But that's the reality of college sports. Everyone understands that the hiring of coaches is very weird. You don't know the half of it. I can promise you that. And frankly, I don't even know the half of it. But the other funny part of this, kind of to me at least, funny part of this was apparently during this blow up that happened between Nick Saban and Jimmy Sexton, Lane Kiffin had called Sexton beforehand and said, Saban's about to call you because he's not too happy with me, because apparently he had told Saban he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that is the last thing you want to say to Nick Saban. But at the end of the day, it is one of those things that you didn't need to be a rocket scientist, you didn't need to be a psychologist, you didn't need to be, a body language expert to understand these two guys were very different people, and they got along because they won football games. And that's kind of what I want to get to right here is, this is why Nick Saban is who he is. Plain and simple. This is why Nick Saban is as special, as incredible in this sport as he is, because, oh, excuse me, I apologize for that. Did not mean to do that one bit. But he is outright special for 10 different reasons. And the biggest reason is he's willing to put his ego aside. He's willing to work with people that maybe aren't his best friends outside the office, but if they're winning football games, that's the ultimate goal. And if you remember back in 2013, 2014, it was not an easy transition for Nick Saban to go from pounding the rock, what they called murder ball over at Alabama, to what they needed to do, which was spread the ball out, which was get a little bit more multiple on offense and push the ball down the field. That was not something that he was willing to do for a long time. And Lane Kiffin was the one that kind of ushered in that new era. And then Sark took over, and then a number of things happened that made that one of the scariest offenses in the country. But overall, it was one of those hires that a lot of people wouldn't have made. And a lot of people wouldn't have made it, not because it wouldn't have been the best thing for their program, but because they didn't want to, because they didn't want to work with that guy, because they didn't want to have to deal with it. And Nick Saban kind of knew that, but he also knew this guy can let us win football games. This guy can keep us where we are, which is at the very top of college football. And that was exactly what happened. So all of the craziness, all of the behind-the-scenes stuff, we can talk about it every which way from Tuesday. But at the end of the day, Nick Saban is who he is because he's willing to put that aside. He's willing to say, this might not be the prettiest situation behind the scenes, but as long as we're putting points on the board and more points than the guys on the other side, I have no problem. So that's part of why Nick Saban is so special. Everyone talks about the X's and O's and his defensive acumen, and he has an incredible amount of that. Don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, the thing that made him so special was his ability to make coaching hires that made sense and make coaching hires that maybe weren't going to fit too well off the field, but on the field it was going to make you a winner. So that's one of the biggest takeaways I had, was just Nick Saban is willing to do just about anything to keep that dynasty alive, and it's one of the reasons he's so special. Having that ability to put your ego aside and say, yeah, I'll hire this guy that I tend to believe is not going to work too well here because I think he's going to help us win football games. So that was one of my bigger takeaways. The other takeaway is plain and obvious, and it's staring us in the face, and a lot of people, for whatever reason, have not been really talking about it too much, and it's Jimmy Sexton. He is the most powerful man in this sport, and it might be by a country mile. This guy can define everything in the world of college football for quite some time, particularly in the SEC, because go ahead and look at his client list. It is a lot of the premier coaches in this sport, whether it's Kalen DeBoer or Steve Sarkisian or Dan Lanning or Kirby Smart or Mike Norvell. They're all Jimmy Sexton guys, along with Lane Kiffin. So it's one of those things that we talk about all of the TV executives. We talk about all the ADs and the presidents and all the people that affect this sport. The most powerful guy you might not even know. It's Jimmy Sexton standing in the hallway of some game, holding a phone call from an AD to give to Lane Kiffin after the 2016 SEC title. So he's that guy. He's the guy that brokers a lot of these deals. And it's the reality of a lot of coaching hires around, where there are some things that happen that maybe don't have too much to do with football, but it makes it happen. It makes the hire get through, and it's a very, very, very interesting thing. And a lot of people took it away as Nick Saban can be pushed around. Nick Saban can, be malleable to whatever he needs. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think he just understands that Jimmy Sexton is who he is because he knows a lot about football and he knows a lot about these guys. And I think he understands that although Lane Kiffin can be a little bit frustrating at times, he absolutely is someone that can elevate our team. And I think that's the thing that really makes Nick Saban as special as he is. All of the game plans, all of the intensity at practice, all of the technical stuff he's incredible at. There's no doubt about that. He's also miles better at making sure that everyone around him is as good, as incredible as they possibly can be. And that comes down to offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators, personnel groups, recruiting staff, whatever it is. Everyone's held to a really high standard, and Lane Kiffin was as well. He just didn't necessarily meet it all that often. But at the end of the day, this was two very, very different guys. These are two very different approaches to coaching football. One's not necessarily better than the other. Now, a lot of people would tell you Nick Saban way is the right way, and I understand that, no doubt about it. But Lane Kiffin can absolutely be successful with the way that he's going about business, and it looks like he might just well be this upcoming year. But at the end of the day, none of this is super surprising. We all saw the interactions on the sideline like that one. We all saw all of the stuff that kind of went back and forth between these two, and it's definitely going to be one of those things that no one's necessarily surprised that they weren't the biggest fans of each other. I think the big surprise was how much power Jimmy Sexton has, and the fact that Nick Saban was even willing to make the hire in the first place. So it's a number of things that you can pull away from this. But overall, I mean, you look at these guys, they're well past all of this stuff. They, in at least outwardly. They've been very, very cordial to each other, and they will cross paths again. Nick Saban will be covering a game in Oxford at some point, and I really do hope he picks against the Rebels. Plain and simple, I really want him to keep that going. But at the end of the day, I don't think these guys hate each other. I don't think they're, out to get each other by any means. But it's definitely one of those stories that you knew that they didn't love each other. You didn't necessarily know the depth of it, and it's definitely a very interesting thing, and it shows you just how powerful Jimmy Sexton is in the world of college football, and it's a name that you might not hear too much on headlines, but you hear plenty behind the scenes, and he is a just massive power broker in this sport. So it's a very, very interesting piece. It's definitely a book that I absolutely will crack open once it does come out, but at the end of the day, it's one of those things that not overly surprising. None of this really caught me by surprise or really shocked me at the end of the day, because everyone knew that this was a relationship that at best was testy, at best was a little bit weird, at best was off kilter. But at the end of the day, Saban got to leave with the last laugh. He's 0-5 against Kiffin as head coaches, and now he gets to be on College game day and probably pick against him during those games. But at the end of the day, I don't think these guys hate each other. I don't think they have vitriol for each other, but I do think during those games, they had just a little bit. There was a little bit extra energy in those, and you see where it came from. So a crazy story, one of those that, you never really know the details of all of this stuff, and frankly, there's many more details behind the scenes that I don't even know that hopefully at some point I'll be, able to see behind the scenes of this sport. But at the end of the day, it's off the charts crazy how Nick Saban was able to handle all of this, hire this guy that he knew wasn't going to be the greatest fit, and still go on to win national titles. And then when he walked out the door right before a national title, it didn't necessarily stop their beat. Now, they did lose that game, but at the end of the day, they kept moving on, and it was just incredible to watch, and it's one of those big-time testaments of what Nick Saban is, and an even bigger testament of who Jimmy Sexton is in the sport. But we'll take our second break here, and when we come back, we got a recruiting update for you guys. A couple of commitments, not too many commitments to update you on, but plenty of commitments coming up over the next little bit, and definitely some ones that I need to get on y'all's radar. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.